The champagne bottle cracked against the edge of the marble bar, and the sound sliced through the ballroom like a gunshot dressed in silk. 240 guests turned at once. On the raised platform beneath a chandelier that had been flown in from Vienna, Kang Min-jae smiled the way a wolf smiles at a limping deer, and he raised the broken green neck of the bottle so the golden liquid ran down his wrist and dripped, one slow bead at a time, onto the shoulder of the woman standing 3 steps below him. "Some women are born to be seen," he said, loud enough for the string quartet to lower their bows. "Others are born to sweep up after the seen ones leave. Sweetheart, you wandered into the wrong room." The woman did not flinch. Her black dress had cost less than the tip he had left the valet, and the champagne was ruining it in a slow, glittering line from her collarbone to her elbow. She was 29 years old, 5'6", with hair pulled back in a knot so plain it almost looked like an insult in a room full of imported extensions. Her name, on the guest list, was Yoo Yoon-so. Nobody in the room knew that name would not be found on any birth certificate in the Republic of Korea. "You were brought here by mistake," Min-jae continued, tossing the broken bottle to an aide who caught it without looking. "Girls like you always leave through the service elevator. Save us both the embarrassment." A laugh went up from the corner where his lieutenant stood, and then a second laugh, thinner, from the socialites nearer the door. Somewhere behind her, a woman lifted her phone before remembering the strict no-photo rule and lowering it, ashamed and thrilled at the same time. A senator's son looked at his shoes. A pop star stared openly, waiting for the tears. The tears did not come. Yoonso lifted her chin 1 slow degree. She reached up with 2 fingers and wiped a bead of champagne from her jaw as though brushing away a mosquito. Then she looked at Min-jae the way a surgeon looks at an X-ray already streaked with shadow. "You should have asked my real name," she said, "before you decided how small I was." For half a heartbeat, the room went so still that the ice in the sculpted swan on the buffet could be heard cracking. Then, from the marble hallway beyond the ballroom, a phone rang. Not a guest's phone, a landline, the ancient hotel kind, sharp and old-fashioned. A concierge in a white glove picked it up, listened, and his face turned the color of wet paper. He began walking quickly toward Min-jae's chief of security. Whatever he whispered made the security chief look at his watch, then at the ceiling, then at the woman in the ruined black dress who was already turning toward the elevator, spine straight, heels quiet, her one small clutch tucked neatly under her arm. But to understand how one glass of champagne could burn an entire empire to the ground before sunrise, we have to go back. Back before the ballroom, back before the broken bottle, back to a small apartment above a bakery in Gyeongsu-dong, where the woman the world would soon call the Ghost Princess was living a life so ordinary that even her neighbors had stopped noticing her. Because if you want to see exactly what happens when arrogance meets a truth it never bothered to check, stay with this story until the very last minute. The ending will change the way you look at every quiet person in every loud room. And if stories about karma finding its target in the sharpest possible way inspire you, hit that subscribe button right now. What is coming next, you will not want to miss. 14 months before the champagne, the bakery on the ground floor of the 4-story building in Gyeongsu-dong opened at 4 in the morning, and by 4:15, the entire stairwell smelled of yeast, butter, and warm sugar. On the second floor, in an apartment with one window that faced a brick wall and one window that faced a persimmon tree, a woman poured hot water over a scoop of drip coffee and listened to the pigeons argue on the ledge. She wore a gray cotton robe that had been washed so many times the sleeves had gone soft as tissue. Her feet were bare on cold linoleum. She was, according to the mailbox downstairs, a freelance translator named Yoo Yoon-so. She was not. Her real name was Cheon Se-rin, and if her passport photo had been printed in any Korean newspaper, the whole country would have leaned closer to read the caption. She was the only living child of the late Cheon Il-kwon, the founder and chairman of the Cheon Group, a conglomerate that owned shipping lanes from Busan to Rotterdam, a pharmaceutical arm that supplied half of Southeast Asia, a defense electronics division that never advertised, and a media wing that could raise or bury a career in a single Tuesday morning meeting. She had been educated in Boston, trained in Zurich, and hidden for the last 3 years in Seongsu-dong under a translator's cover so complete that her tax records looked as boring as her neighbors. She had disappeared from public life on the day her older brother, Cheon Woo-jin, was found dead in a service stairwell of a Uido office tower with a printed suicide note in his pocket and 3 broken fingernails that no coroner ever explained. She had not believed the note. She had never believed the note. The coffee was too hot. She drank it anyway. On the small pine table in front of her sat a spiral notebook, the kind school children used, filled with names, dates, wire transfer routing numbers, and small blue stars beside the names that mattered most. At the top of the 3rd page, underlined twice, was one name, Kang Min Jae. She had been building the notebook for 2.5 years. She had followed money through 3 continents. She had traded her name for a fake one, her penthouse for a walk-up, her drivers for the number 2 bus. Her uncle by loyalty, Chairman Oh Dae-sung, thought she was in Geneva recovering from grief. Every Sunday she called him from a burner phone, routed through a Swiss server, and let him hear the sound of a French cafe behind her voice. He was so relieved to hear her healing that he never asked which cafe. She wore her one good coat, a charcoal wool with a torn silk lining she had never bothered to repair, when she went to meet her only real ally, an anti-corruption prosecutor named Han Ji-woo, who worked out of a windowless office in Gwacheon and drank his coffee cold because he never had time to finish it warm. Ji-woo was 41, tired around the eyes, and the last person in Seoul who had loved her brother enough to keep asking questions after the funeral. He met her every 3rd Thursday at a noodle stand under a highway, and every 3rd Thursday, she slid him one more page of the spiral notebook. "You are getting closer to a wall," Ji-woo said the last Thursday of that autumn, blowing on his broth. "When you hit it, it will hit back." She smiled at him, small and tired. "Then I will need to be standing somewhere it cannot see." She had already picked the somewhere. It was a ballroom on the 50th floor of the Han River Crown Hotel, and it had a date on it. A birthday, a specific man's birthday, the kind of night when arrogance drank too much and forgot to lock its doors. She just needed an invitation the world would consider small enough to ignore. Across the river, in a penthouse that took up an entire floor of a building he had bought under 3 different shell companies, Kang Min Jae was doing push-ups on a black lacquer floor while a 50-inch screen played the morning market report with the sound off. He was 32 years old, 6'1", and had the kind of face photographers loved and mothers warned their daughters about. Sharp jaw, cold eyes, a small white scar running through his left eyebrow from a knife he had taken at 19 and never spoken about since. To the tax bureau, he was the chief executive of KMJ Holdings, a legitimate hospitality and logistics firm. To the National Police Agency, he was a suspect in 17 unsolved matters they could not quite tie together. To the men who ran the ports of Busan, Incheon, and Kobe, he was simply the boss, the youngest ever, the one who had taken over from his mentor after that mentor drove into a bridge abutment at 3 in the morning with no witnesses. Min Jae had wept at the funeral, and everybody had believed the tears, and nobody had ever asked why the brake lines had been changed the week before. His fatal flaw was not cruelty. Cruelty in his world was table stakes. His fatal flaw was that he needed rooms to watch him. He needed the tilt of chins, the lowering of voices, the way a bartender's hand shook the second time he poured. He mistook fear for respect and respect for love, and by 32, he had built an entire life on that mistake. Beside him, always beside him, was Gaa, the divorced daughter of a former minister of transportation. She was 34, beautiful in a lacquered, expensive way, and she had been Min Jae's on and off companion for 4 years. She fed him what he needed most, which was applause. When he told a story at dinner, she laughed one beat too loud. When another woman glanced at him too long, Ga's manicured hand slid onto his forearm like a fence. She was not in love with him. She was in love with the reflection of herself in the mirror of his money. A month before the birthday party, Min Jae took her to a small opening at a jewelry gallery in Cheongdam-dong. A young designer had been given a corner to show her pieces, and the designer was a distant cousin of one of Min Jae's lieutenants, so he showed up out of a favor he would collect on later. The designer was nervous, poor, and talented, and she had made one piece she was particularly proud of, a thin silver cuff hammered to look like river water. Min Jae picked it up, turned it in the light, and dropped it back onto the velvet with a small metallic click. "Cute," he said, "for a girl who dreams of being invited to real parties." The designer laughed the way people laugh when they cannot afford not to. GA laughed harder. In a corner of the gallery, unobserved because she had made herself unobservable, a woman in a plain black coat with a torn silk lining watched the whole exchange and made a small note in a small notebook and left without buying anything. Her name on the gallery's guest list that night was Yoo Yun-so. The invitation to the birthday party arrived through a chain of small favors so ordinary it looked like coincidence. A junior investor at Cheon Group's Singapore office had a daughter who modeled part-time. The daughter had been invited to the party as decoration. Yoon-so, quiet, helpful, the freelance translator who lived above the bakery, had done the girl a small favor the previous spring, translating a modeling contract from Milanese Italian without asking for payment. The daughter, grateful and slightly bored of her usual friends, texted her, "Come with me Saturday. My father says it will be a circus." Yoon-so replied within 30 seconds. She said yes. She said she owned nothing appropriate. The daughter, who admired what she thought was humility, told her that plain was the new bold. Yoon-so thanked her and hung up and stared at the persimmon tree outside her window for a long time. And then she opened a closet in the back of her apartment and took down a garment bag she had not touched in 3 years. Inside the bag was a black cocktail dress her mother had bought her in Paris the year before her mother died. It had no logo. It had no diamonds. It fit her the way water fits a glass. She hung it on the door and looked at it, and for the first time in months, she felt her brother in the room with her. "I am going to walk into his house, Appa," she said quietly, to nobody the neighbors could hear. "I am going to let him show me who he is, and then I am going to decide what to do with what he shows me." The week before the party, 3 small things happened, and each of them would matter later more than anyone in the room knew. First, on a Monday, a container ship registered to one of Min Jae's shell companies was flagged for random inspection in Rotterdam. Random inspections in Rotterdam were never random. The paperwork trail that produced the flag had been placed there 3 months earlier by a compliance officer who did not know she was working for Cheon Group's forensic accounting team. Second, on a Wednesday, a mid-level prosecutor in Seoul quietly filed a sealed motion to unfreeze a 3-year-old case file regarding one Cheon Woo-jin, deceased. The motion was signed by Han Ji-woo, the seal held. Third, on a Friday, Chairman Oh Dae-sung, 71 years old, silver-haired, beloved godfather to the missing heiress, sat in his study in Pyeongchang-dong and poured himself a small glass of Suntory Hibiki and dialed a number he had promised himself, a decade earlier, never to dial again. The number rang in a house in Hanam-dong. A man answered. Oh said only, "The girl is moving." The man on the other end was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Then we move her onto the board where we want her." They both hung up without saying goodbye. Saturday arrived the way expensive nights do, with too much light and too little sky. The 50th floor ballroom of the Han River Crown Hotel had been reshaped for the occasion. 12 tons of white peonies had been trucked in from a farm in Icheon. The chandelier, installed for the night only, held 4,000 hand-cut crystals. The champagne was Krug 2002. The caviar was Osetra. The string quartet had flown in from Prague. The city outside, Seoul at 10 in the evening, all neon and river and glass, served as a backdrop so grand it looked painted. 240 guests came up in 3 private elevators. Each one was scanned, padded, photographed for a private file, and handed a numbered token that would be checked against their name at the door. There were 3 cabinet ministers, 11 CEOs, 4 film stars, 2 K-pop idols, a Macanese casino operator, and 1 plain young woman in a black dress with a torn silk lining she had, that afternoon, quietly stitched shut with her mother's thread. She stepped out of the elevator at 10:12. The junior investor's daughter squeezed her arm and vanished toward a friend. Yunso did not move toward the bar or the buffet. She stood by a window that looked out over the Han River, and she watched. Min-jae saw her within 4 minutes. He was accepting a birthday toast from a shipping magnate, and over the rim of his glass, his eyes moved across the room in the automatic sweep of a predator who has never once in his adult life been the prey. His eyes stopped on her. There was no logo on her dress. There was no watch on her wrist. She was drinking sparkling water from a champagne flute, and her posture was so quiet it looked like a challenge. "Who is that?" he asked softly to the aide at his elbow. The aide checked the tablet. Yun-so, plus one of the Kim daughter, translator, nobody. Nobody, Min-jae repeated, and the word sat in his mouth like a coin he wanted to spend. Ga felt the shift the way she felt weather. She followed his gaze, and her jaw tightened. She had spent 4 years learning where his attention went, and every place it went that was not her felt like a rehearsal for her replacement. She leaned into his ear and murmured something that made him laugh, short and sharp, and turn his shoulder just far enough to include her again. Then one of Min-jae's lieutenants, a thick-necked man named Park who had been drinking since 6, drifted across the floor and planted himself in Yeon-so's path. He said something loud and coarse about the shape of her collarbone. He put his hand on her elbow. She looked down at the hand as though it were a small, unattractive animal that had wandered onto a clean tablecloth. She lifted it off with 2 fingers and set it back at his side, and she said quietly, "Please don't." Park laughed, but the laugh was a beat late. 2 people near him laughed with him, but their laughs were half a beat later still. And in the center of the ballroom, on the raised platform, Min-jae watched, and something in his jaw hardened. Embarrassment in his world was contagious, and the only cure he knew for it was humiliation. He came down off the platform with a fresh bottle of Krug in his hand and a fresh smile on his face, and the crowd parted for him the way water parts for a knife. He asked her name. She told him. He asked who had brought her. She told him. He asked if she was enjoying his hospitality. "I was," she said, "until a moment ago." He liked that. He liked the little sting of it. It gave him permission for what he had already decided to do. He gestured at her dress, at her bare throat, at her plain shoes. He said the sentence about side doors and back doors. He said the sentence about knowing her place. The room began to laugh, nervous at first, then bolder, the way rooms do when a king gives them permission to be cruel. Then he broke the neck of the bottle against the marble bar, and he poured the golden Krug over her shoulder in a long, slow line, and the ballroom went silent enough to hear the ice swan crack. She did not cry. She did not run. She lifted her chin 1 slow degree, wiped a bead from her jaw, and gave him the sentence that would follow him, in whispers, for the rest of his life. "You should have asked my real name," she said, "before you decided how small I was." She turned. She walked. Her heels made a quiet, even sound on the marble. Nobody moved to help her. Ga smirked into her glass. Min-jae raised his broken bottle in a mocking salute at her back. The music uncertainly started again. In the hallway, that ancient hotel landline rang, and a concierge in a white glove began walking quickly toward the head of security. Yunso walked past him without turning her head. She stepped into the elevator. She pressed the button for the lobby. As the doors closed, she took her phone out of her clutch and she typed 1 word, "Now," and she sent it to 7 people at once. The 7 people were not friends. They were bank compliance officers in London and Zurich, a customs supervisor in Incheon, a senior investigator at Korea's Financial Services Commission, a foreign correspondent at Reuters in Tokyo, and prosecutor Han Ji-woo in Gwacheon. Each of them had been waiting for months for 1 word from 1 number. They received it at 10:47 in the evening, Seoul time, and they began in 7 different time zones to work. The city slept. The city always slept badly, but that night it slept, and the empire of Kang Min-jae came apart in the dark. At 5:12 in the morning, 3 international banks froze accounts linked to KMJ Logistics after a coordinated compliance flag on suspicious wire activity dating back 4 years. At 5:40, customs officers, working from a warrant signed by a judge who had not been on Min Jae's payroll list because she was too new to have been noticed, raided a warehouse in Incheon that held 6 shipping containers of undeclared electronics and one that held something worse. At 6:15, a casino development project in Macau was suspended after anonymously delivered ledgers arrived at the Judiciary Police. At 6:50, a two-term member of the National Assembly, on the phone with a reporter who already had the emails in front of her, denied ever having met a man named Kang. By 7:30, 2 of Min Jae's captains had cleared their safes and boarded separate flights, one to Vancouver and one to Ho Chi Minh City. At 7:40, Min Jae, still in yesterday's shirt, still smelling of Krug and someone else's perfume, walked into his war room on the 43rd floor of a building he owned and demanded to know who was killing him. By 11, every path led back to one name, the Cheon Group. At noon, a formal meeting request arrived on his private secretary's desk. It was on cream stationery so thick it felt like a small piece of wood. It was signed in ink by Cheon Se-rin, sole heiress of the Cheon Group. The meeting location was not a neutral hotel, not a private club, not a boardroom in Yeouido. The meeting location was his own conference room, on his own floor, in his own building. At 1 o'clock, a convoy of 3 armored Mercedes rolled into his underground garage. His guards stiffened. His lieutenants palmed weapons they had been careful, in the last hour, not to remove. The back door of the middle car opened, and the woman who stepped out was the woman from the party. Same eyes, same calm. Now an ivory-tailored suit. Now black gloves so soft they made no sound against each other. Now, a Vacheron Constantin on her left wrist that had been designed for her father in 1988 and inherited by her at 23. She walked into his conference room the way she had walked out of his ballroom. His men did not know what to do with their hands. His secretary set down a tea tray and forgot to pour. Se-rin sat, crossed her ankles, folded her gloved hands on the table, and looked at him. "Kang Min Jae," she said, "my name is Cheon Se-rin. My brother was Cheon Woo Jin. 3 years ago, one of your companies was used to disgrace him before he was killed. I have spent those 3 years buying the ground you have been standing on. As of this morning, you are renting your life from me." She slid a folder across the table. Inside it were 43 pages. Every page was a knife. He read the first 3. He set the folder down. Something in his face, the muscle just under the left eye, began to twitch in a way it had not twitched since he was 19 years old and losing. "I did not kill your brother," he said. His voice was quieter than he had intended. "I did not ask if you did. You will. I will not need to. I have men who will." He looked at her a long time. He was arrogant, cruel, and dangerous, and he had learned to read faces the way other men learn to read balance sheets. He looked at her, and for the first time in a very long time, he was afraid of the person across a table from him. But underneath the fear, something else clicked into place. An older instinct, the one that had kept him alive at 19. He had been used. He knew the taste of it. "Give me 3 days," he said. She almost laughed. "Give me 3 days," he said again, "and I will hand you the man who actually killed your brother. Then you can decide what to do with me. But if you burn me down first, the man who did it will be standing at your funeral holding your father's shares." She looked at him for a long time. His face was pale. His hands were steady. He did not sound like a liar. He sounded like a man who had just realized he had spent his whole life on somebody else's chessboard, and that he was, at best, a rook that had been allowed to feel like a king. Against every advisor's whispered instruction, she nodded once. 72 hours, she said. Then I bury you either way. Over 3 days, in safe houses that neither of them owned, and in cars that changed every 4 hours, Cheon Se-rin and Kang Min Jae dismantled a story they had both believed. Woo Jin had not been investigating Min Jae. Woo Jin had been investigating something Woo Jin had privately named the White Circle, an alliance of chaebol heirs, senior prosecutors, media chairmen, and mafia intermediaries that manipulated markets, elections, and, when necessary, obituaries. Min Jae had been useful to them. He had never been one of them. He had been the hammer, never the hand. and the hand in the last decade had belonged to one man, Chairman O. Dae-sung, her father's oldest friend, the silver-haired uncle who had wept at her father's funeral, who had wept again at her brother's funeral, who had held her hand at both, who had steered her gently, patiently 3 years ago toward the name Kang Min-jae. Seirin sat in the back seat of a car on the Olympic Expressway and read the last document Min-jae's people had pulled, a scan of a private ledger in O's own handwriting, dated the week before her brother's death. She read it twice. She did not cry. Her jaw set the way her father's had set the day he decided to buy a shipping line his rivals had thought was untouchable. "He is the one who told me to hate you," she said quietly. Min-jae, beside her, said nothing. "He needed us to destroy each other." "Yes." She turned her head and looked at him. In the low light from the dashboard, his face was thinner than she had realized. There was, beside his left thumb, a scar she had not noticed. She thought of a rainy alley in Tokyo 4 years earlier, when she had been followed after her brother's funeral, and a stranger had stepped between her and 3 men and fought them off and disappeared before she could see his face. She had kept only one object from that night. A silver lighter someone had dropped in the rain, with a small dragon carved into its side. That afternoon in the safe house, Min-jae had reached into his pocket for a lighter and set it on the table without thinking. Silver, a small dragon carved into its side. She had not said anything then. She had not been sure. She was sure now. "You saved me once," she said. He looked at her. "In Tokyo, in the rain." He looked at his hands. "I did not know who you were," he said. "I only knew there were 3 of them and one of you." They rode the rest of the way in silence. The city outside was gray with morning. Somewhere across it, Chairman Oh Dae-sung was drinking green tea in a study lined with her father's books and preparing to attend a charity gala. The gala was held at the National Museum of Contemporary Art, and the guest list read like an index to the country. Seirin arrived on the arm of no one. Min-jae arrived through a service entrance dressed as a caterer, because Min-jae had learned, as a boy, that the most useful thing about being feared was that people stopped looking at your face when you carried a tray. At 9, Seirin took the microphone. She thanked the donors. She announced, to gasps, a merger. Cheon Group's media and defense divisions would be placed temporarily under a stewardship led by Chairman Oh Dae-sung, her father's oldest friend, until the board could complete a full succession review. The room applauded. Oh, in the front row, rose and bowed, once left, once right. His silver hair caught the light. He looked for a moment exactly like the grandfather figure the country had believed him to be. Then the screens behind Seirin changed. Woojin's face appeared, 3 years younger than he would ever be again, alive on a recording he had made 2 days before his death. He spoke for 4 minutes. He named names. He named Oh Dae-sung. He named a senior deputy chief prosecutor, a network chairman, a defense minister, and, at the end, quietly, a young man named Kang Min-jae, whom he described as a tool the circle intended to discard. Screens along the walls began to play ledgers, wire transfers, encrypted messages, an order, signed in a cipher long since broken, to arrange an accident on a stairwell in Uedo. Panic did not erupt. Panic was too small a word. A cabinet minister vomited into a peony arrangement. A network chairman ran for the coat check and was tackled by a young officer who had, 6 months earlier, been recruited by an international anti-corruption task force Seirin had prepared as insurance and never mentioned to anyone in her own company. Chairman O did not run. He turned slowly and looked up at Seirin on the platform, and something ancient and tired moved across his face. Then he reached into his jacket and produced a small, old, expensive pistol. Min-jae, still holding a tray, was closer than any bodyguard. He stepped in front of her. The shot went into his chest, just below the collarbone, on the side of the old scar over his eyebrow, as though his body had been designed all his life to take that bullet and no other. O was taken down by 3 officers before he could fire again. The white circle, all of it, unraveled in a single night. The country woke up the next morning to the biggest corruption purge in its modern history. The papers used the phrase, "clean to the bone." Min-jae survived, barely. In a private room in a hospital that officially did not exist, Siren sat by his bed for 2 nights without speaking, and on the third morning, she left a letter on the tray beside his water. The letter was 1 page. It read, "What hurt at your party was not the champagne. Champagne washes out. What hurt was that you looked at a room full of strangers and let them decide what I was worth to you. My brother once said the true measure of a man is not the size of the room he fills, but the size of the person he sees when the room is empty. I am not writing to tell you I forgive you. I am writing to tell you I saw you step in front of a bullet for a woman you had once poured a drink over, and I do not know yet what to do with that. Heal first, then decide who you are going to be for the rest of your life. Whoever he is, I hope he is a stranger to the man in that ballroom." They found him crying quietly when the nurse came in an hour later. He had not cried, according to the nurse's later notes, since he was 11 years old. 9 months passed. Seoul in early autumn looked, from the 50th floor of the Han River Crown Hotel, exactly the way it had looked the night of the party. But the 50th floor was under new management because the hotel had been quietly acquired by Cheon Group's hospitality arm, and the ballroom was booked that afternoon for a foundation opening. Cheon Se-rin stood at a podium in a plain navy suit, no logo, no diamonds, one thin silver cuff on her right wrist that she had bought in cash from a young designer in Cheongdam-dong she had gone back to find the week after the gala. The foundation she was opening was named for her brother. It provided legal aid, protection, and long-term counseling to families of victims of organized corruption. Its first 3 cases were already filed. She still lived part of the time in the apartment above the bakery in Seongsu-dong. She still bought her coffee from the machine on the corner. Her chief of staff, who had learned not to argue, drove her there and waited outside in a black car that had been mocked in the neighborhood, until the neighborhood realized who the woman in the gray robe on the second floor had always been. At the foundation opening, after the ribbons and the speeches and the cameras, she stepped away from the crowd, out onto the wide stone terrace above the river. The rain was thin and cold. It was the kind of rain her brother had loved. At the far end of the terrace, past the reporters, past the security line, past the last umbrella, a man stood alone at the railing. He wore a dark, plain coat. His hair had gone gray at the temples in a way it had not a year earlier. He carried no weapon. He was not being guarded. He was, according to public records, a man who no longer legally existed under his old name. She walked to him. He did not turn until she was very close. "You came," she said. "I told myself I would only stand at the back," he said. His voice was quieter than it had been in the conference room. "I did not intend to be seen. You are not by them." She glanced back at the crowd. "Only by me." They stood for a while. The river moved beneath them. Somewhere below, a boat's horn sounded, low and thoughtful. "You wanted to ask me something," he said. "Even in your letter you did not ask it." She looked at him. Her face, in the rain, was the face he had seen across a ballroom, tilted 1 slow degree upward. "If a stranger had stopped you in the hallway that night," she said quietly, "and told you exactly who I was, daughter of Cheon Il-kwan, sister of the man your circle killed, the woman who had built a cage around your entire empire, would you have poured that champagne over my shoulder?" He opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at the river. He did not answer. The silence stretched. It became the answer. She nodded once, slowly, as though something inside her that had been standing for 3 years was finally allowed to sit down. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me the truth." She reached into the pocket of her coat. She took out the silver lighter with the small carved dragon, the one she had carried through 4 years and 2 countries, and she placed it carefully in his palm. His fingers closed around it. He did not look at her. "I have carried that for you long enough," she said. "You saved my life once in Tokyo. You stepped in front of a bullet for me at that gala. You also poured champagne on my mother's dress and called me nothing in a room of 240 people. Nobody carries only one of those. You have to carry them all now. That is your work, not mine." She turned. She walked back toward the crowd. She did not look back. Behind her at the railing, Kang Min Jae stood in the rain with a silver lighter in his fist and a scar under his coat, and he was crying again, quietly, the way he had cried 9 months earlier when a nurse he did not know brought him a letter that had cost him his last certainty. He did not follow her. He watched until the last of the umbrellas closed around her navy suit and swallowed her back into the world she had earned. Then he pulled his collar up, tucked the lighter deep into his pocket, and walked unseen into the Seoul rain. He was never photographed at the foundation. Officially, he was not there. Some people said in later years that he lived in a fishing village on the southern coast. Some said he had died. One reporter, off the record, said she had seen him working 6 months later in the kitchen of a small legal aid center in a city she declined to name, chopping onions with the calm, careful precision of a man who had finally found a room small enough to see everyone in. Because in the end, the real measure of a person is never the size of the ballroom that cheers their name, the depth of the account under their signature, or the number of people who fear them enough to laugh at their jokes. The real measure is what they see and what they choose to see in the quiet person standing right in front of them. Before they know who that person will one day become, before the phones start ringing at 5 in the morning, before the champagne, in its slow golden line, teaches them exactly how small they always were.